Rowan Decker had not thought about the carpenter's level in weeks, which was unusual, because for most of the 18 years since Leanne died, the sight of it on his workshop shelf was the first thing his eyes found every morning. He noticed the absence only later, driving to Mercy General in the gray November light, the way you sometimes notice a sound only once it has already stopped. He was there for his son. Miles Decker had taken a hard fall at a job site the previous afternoon. Nothing broken, the foreman had said on the phone, but the wrist needed imaging, and Miles had asked his father to come. That was all it was supposed to be. A Tuesday morning, the waiting room smelling of floor cleaner and vending machine coffee. A wall-mounted television murmuring weather above a row of plastic chairs. Rowan had taken a seat near the window and was turning his work cap in his hands the way he always did when he couldn't do anything useful. And that was the moment the far door opened and a woman walked through it. He told himself later that the mind plays that kind of trick on a person, that grief kept long enough will eventually project itself onto strangers if a man isn't careful. He told himself that for approximately 4 seconds. Then the woman turned her head and he saw her face clearly for the first time in 18 years. And his hands went completely still. Leanne. Not a version of her, not a woman who happened to share the angle of her jaw or the quiet way she moved through a crowded space. Leanne herself, older now, thinner at the temples, her hair pulled back in the plain, practical style she had always preferred over anything that required more than 2 minutes. She crossed the waiting room without seeing him, heading toward the reception desk, and beside her walked a teenage girl with her mother's height and a stranger's face, and hands that were folded flat against her thighs in the exact particular stillness that Rowan Decker had never seen on another living person besides himself. He said her name before he could stop himself. The single word crossed the room, and Leanne stopped moving, as though the sound had physically touched her. She turned, and for one unguarded moment her face showed something raw and irreversible before it closed again into careful stillness. She said something low and quick to the girl, and when the girl's eyes found Rowan across the waiting room, they held the same gray-green color he had looked at every morning of his life in the mirror above the bathroom sink. He caught up to them in the parking structure on the second level, his footsteps echoing off cold concrete. Leanne did not run. She stood beside a 10-year-old Civic and waited for him with the posture of a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment for a very long time. When he asked her, not shouting, barely above a whisper, how a dead woman was standing in front of him in a hospital parking garage, she told him she would explain everything, but not there, and not while the hospital's external camera was pointed directly at the stairwell 8 feet behind him. The girl beside her finally spoke. She asked her mother, in a voice that moved between asking and already knowing, whether this man standing in front of them was the father she had been told was gone. Rowan drove them to his workshop on Alderman Road, a converted outbuilding behind the house, where he had restored furniture and reviewed structural blueprints for the better part of 2 decades. It smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular kind of quiet that accumulates in a space where one person has worked alone for a very long time. He set out 3 mugs of coffee that none of them touched, and sat on his work stool and looked at the 2 of them across the scarred surface of his workbench. The girl introduced herself first. Her name was Cora Ashford. Ashford being Leanne's maiden name, the one she had used every day for 18 years, because her married name was the one name she had not been able to keep. Cora said it carefully, the way a person says a word they have decided to retire. She was 17 years old. She had grown up believing her father died in a construction accident 3 months before she was born. She had learned the truth only 6 weeks ago, when her mother sat down beside her on a motel bed in Tucson and told her that she was wrong about almost everything she thought she knew about her own life. Leanne began at the beginning. 18 years ago, she had been a safety compliance auditor at Vales Drexler Construction Group, a regional firm that had spent 30 years building a reputation on federal contracts and mid-market residential projects across 4 states. She had been good at the job, methodical in a way that made her supervisors value her, and made Preston Vale, the company's founder and chief executive, tolerate her with a patience she understood. Only later was entirely conditional. 3 weeks before the collapse of the Hendricks Avenue warehouse, Leanne had found discrepancies in the load-bearing certifications that Vale Drexler had filed for 11 buildings completed over the previous 5 years. Documents bearing the signatures of inspectors who, in several cases, she could confirm had never visited the sites they were certifying. She took the evidence to a compliance attorney named George Pell, who had handled whistleblower cases and whose name had been passed to her by a former colleague. George confirmed that what she had found constituted federal fraud at a scale that would likely end the company. He advised her to digitize everything and keep the physical copies off-site while he prepared the formal filing. 3 days later, the Hendricks Avenue warehouse came down during a midnight shift. 4 workers died. The preliminary reports cited structural failure in the load-bearing columns. The same columns whose certifications were among the documents Leanne had already flagged. The following morning, a man named Curtis Bragg came to their home while Rowan was at work. Curtis introduced himself as the head of Vale Drexler Corporate Security, though Leanne later came to understand that his actual function was something considerably less official. He showed her photographs, Rowan at his workshop, Miles, 3 years old at the time, at the daycare on Clement Street. He told her that Preston Vale was not a man who accepted the existence of a problem he couldn't resolve, and that the resolution he preferred was for the problem to disappear completely. If she cooperated, he said, the people in those photographs would remain safe and unaware that any problem had ever existed. Leanne made her decision in the parking lot of the daycare that same afternoon. Watching through the chain-link fence while Miles chased a plastic ball across the play yard with the lopsided run of a toddler who had only recently discovered that running was an option. She did not yet know she was pregnant. She learned that a month later, in a rented room outside Memphis, from a drugstore test taken alone on a Wednesday morning with the door locked and the window cracked against the August heat. She had told herself in those first months that the separation was temporary, that George Pell would find a way to file safely, that federal investigators would move fast enough to make a return possible. Before Miles stopped watching the front door, George Pell died of a heart attack 14 months after Leanne disappeared. His case files passed to his estate attorney, a man named Douglas Rand, who had enough professional discretion to understand that certain documents should be preserved without advertising their existence. Before his own death 3 years ago, Douglas had arranged for everything, encrypted, notarized, fully authenticated, to be held in a digital trust accessible only by Cora Ashford on the date of her 18th birthday. He had structured it that way deliberately, in Cora's name alone, because Leanne had insisted that no document connecting the trust to Miles or Rowan ever be created. She would not let her name pull a fresh target onto the 2 people she had already sacrificed everything to keep off the board. Rowan listened without standing up. When Leanne finished, the refrigerator in the corner of the shop clicked through a cycle in the silence. Then he asked her, in a voice that was very controlled, and therefore more frightening than raised would have been, why she had not found another way back once the immediate danger passed. She answered slowly, the way people do when they have rehearsed a question for years without arriving at a clean answer. She told him she had tried twice, through intermediaries who lost their nerve before any message reached him. She told him that the longer the silence extended, the more it began to resemble a deliberate decision rather than a circumstance that had overtaken her, and that somewhere in the weight of the accumulated years, she had lost the ability to clearly see the difference between those two things. Rowan asked her, more quietly now, whether she understood that every birthday Miles had spent wondering what was wrong with him, why his mother had not wanted to stay, was a question she had allowed that boy to carry alone. Leanne did not try to answer that one. Miles arrived at the workshop that evening, with his wrist in a soft brace and a skepticism so well organized it was almost formal. He had driven over because his father called and asked him to come, and he spent the drive composing a careful, reasonable explanation for whatever was being run on a man who had spent 18 years keeping grief too quiet to name. That explanation lasted until he opened the workshop door and saw his mother standing beside the workbench, and then it dissolved entirely, because there was no version of what he had prepared that accounted for this being true. He did not embrace her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment with his good hand pressed flat against the frame, and then he came inside and sat down and looked at Cora with an expression that was working very hard to hold its shape. He asked Leanne, in the careful voice he used when he was trying not to raise it, whether she understood that his father had worked a second job for 6 years to keep the house going while also raising a child alone, and that he had done it without once telling Miles that any of it was hard. Leanne said she was sorry, simply, without preface, without explanation attached. Cora watched her brother across the workbench with the close attention of someone absorbing a lesson she hadn't known she would need. She asked him whether his anger was aimed at their mother or at what had been done to all of them. Miles said he didn't know yet. Cora said that was fair. 2 days before the digital trust was set to activate, Preston Vale appeared at Rowan's front door. He was 71 years old and dressed with the unself-conscious precision of a man who had never needed to impress anyone in a room. He moved through Rowan's front hallway with a proprietary ease, settled into the living room armchair without waiting to be invited, and made his offer without wrapping it in anything decorative. $2.4 million for a signed affidavit stating that the woman claiming to be Leanne Ashford Decker was an imposter with a credible resemblance and a financial motive. He mentioned twice that Rowan had nothing material to gain from a legal conflict against a company with 40 lawyers on retainer. Rowan told him no. Preston Vale stood to leave and made his only real mistake in the doorway. He referred to Cora by her full legal name and noted that her 18th birthday was in 2 days, information no one had given him, and that he could not have known unless his people had been tracking the girl for some time. The slip told Rowan everything he needed to understand about how long Preston had known Cora existed. Something settled hard in his chest, and whatever had briefly wavered in him was finished wavering. The trust activated at midnight on Cora's birthday. Douglas Rand's estate attorney delivered the decryption key by certified courier, and Cora opened the files on a laptop, borrowed from Miles, all 4 of them sitting around Rowan's kitchen table in the early hours of a Thursday morning. The files were comprehensive, scanned originals, chain of custody records, direct correspondence showing Preston Vale's authorization of the falsified certifications, and a separate tranche documenting 6 additional buildings that had failed inspection and been recertified through the same fraudulent channel. One of those buildings was the Alderman Heights residential complex, currently under active construction 2 miles from Rowan's house. Miles Decker had been working the steel framing on that project for 4 months. The federal filing, submitted through a whistleblower attorney Cora had located in advance, moved faster than anyone expected. The Hendricks Avenue collapse had never fully closed as a federal safety investigation, and the arrival of authenticated documentation naming the responsible party gave investigators everything they needed to issue a preservation order against Vale Drexler's financial records within 72 hours. Preston Vale was suspended from company operations by his own board of directors 2 weeks later. Construction on Alderman Heights was halted pending full structural review. Miles was the one who flagged the specific column certifications to the federal inspector. He knew the measurements because he had been walking that site for months, and because something about those columns had never looked right to him and he had simply never had a reason to push on it before now. The families of the 4 workers who died at Hendricks Avenue filed a civil action within 30 days of the federal filing. Rowan gave a deposition. He sat in a conference room and answered questions for 4 hours, and drove home and sat in his workshop until past midnight without turning on the lights. Leanne did not move back into the house on Alderman Road. She rented a room above a hardware store 6 blocks away, which felt right to both of them in a way neither of them tried to articulate. They had dinner twice in the first month, in a diner with bad coffee and private booths, and talked mostly about Miles and Cora, and occasionally about what they each remembered of the first years of their marriage, which felt simultaneously very near and very far away. Rowan did not reach across the table. He did not pretend that 18 years of absence could be forgiven in the course of 2 dinners and a federal investigation. He told her, plainly and without cruelty, that whatever they had been to each other had ended. The morning the world declared her dead, and that anything that came next between them would need to be built from nothing rather than recovered from the wreckage. Leanne accepted that without argument, and something in her shoulders eased slightly, as though she had been bracing for a harder answer than the one she received. Miles began meeting her for Sunday breakfast. He always arrived exactly on time and left exactly when he said he would, and Leanne understood that this precision was not coldness, but was the only form of control a person has when they are letting something back in that damaged them the first time around. Cora enrolled in the community college on the far side of town and changed her surname to Decker 4 months after her birthday, legally and without ceremony. She told Rowan that same evening, mentioned it in passing the way you mention, something that has been decided for a long time and only required the right moment to become official. On a Saturday afternoon in late spring, with the workshop door open to let in the warmer air, Rowan was recalibrating an old door frame when Cora came in through the side entrance and took up her usual position at the corner of the workbench. Watching him work in the comfortable silence that had grown between them without either of them having to arrange it. At some point he reached back for the carpenter's level. On the shelf behind him, the brass-fitted vintage model with the worn wood housing that Leanne had given him on the day they bought the house on Alderman Road. He set it against the door frame. The bubble drifted. He adjusted. Cora watched him do it, and then she reached across, lifted the level from his hand with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to most things, held it against the frame herself, and checked his work. She handed it back without comment. Rowan set it on the shelf where it had always lived and stood looking at it for a moment in the easy afternoon light, the same way he had every morning for 18 years, except that now what it brought back to him had 2 faces instead of 1. He picked up his pencil and went back to work.